today to have with us Commissioner Robert McDowell of the Federal Communications Commission. Before starting our program, I just want to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. In about 10 days, we'll have Jim Miller, former head of the Office of Management and Budget and currently on the Postal Commission board, will come and talk about the effect of the internet on the Postal Service and all the problems the Postal Service is having these days. In December, we're going to have Professor Greg Roston from Stanford University will come speak. But today, we are just extraordinarily pleased to have with us Commissioner Robert McDowell of the Federal Communications Commission, who has served on the commission for about 5-6 years now, has been a great voice of reason at the commission. The format for the program is I'll ask him some questions for maybe 40 minutes or so, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for Q&A. This has been stylized as a fireside chat. So you can imagine there's a fireplace back here, and we're at the McDowell homestead, and just chatting about issues affecting the internet and communications. But before we begin that, unfortunately yesterday, Steve Jobs, the head of Apple, passed away. Certainly one of the great American business leaders of our generation and really of any generation. Commissioner McDowell, did you ever have a chance to meet with Steve Jobs?
I never did. I've been to Apple a couple of times, and each time he's either unavailable, I think sometimes probably because of his health issues, so he did take a leave of absence then before he stepped down. And, he came back and he stepped down as CEO. But he certainly is a great American, quite literally. That sounds corny or cliche, but really is, and is at the top of the heap of innovators. So he'll be missed. And we give our condolences to his family.
It is actually quite striking that Steve Jobs built one of the largest corporations in America from scratch. There was nothing there. And he did it all really through the private sector. I don't think he came to the commission asking for loan guarantees or anything like that. So it was really quite an American success story. I think most Americans today are very concerned about jobs. Unemployment is very high. There's more than 10 million Americans are unemployed. Probably that many or more have given up looking for work. Practically everyone who has a job is worried. I assume that issues related to jobs and employment come up at the commission from time to time. Do people come to the commission and say, if you do this or if you do that, it'll lead to more jobs?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. Many thanks to the Hudson Institute. Our chairs are a little low, so we feel like we're at the kiddie table right now, but you can see our arms up high. But first of all, I think it's important to understand that the government cannot create jobs. Government can redistribute wealth. It can destroy capital and take it elsewhere. But the government cannot create value, cannot create a job. So the second point I want to make, too, is that the most common request we really get at the FCC, which some of you have heard me say before, when you boil it down to the essence of many arguments, is please regulate my rival. And all in the name of maybe jobs or something else. So you have to look beyond some of the rhetoric. I don't think anyone has made an argument at the commission saying, if you adopt this, please adopt this because it will reduce jobs. It's usually not a good selling point. So sure, I'm sure that over the years that the dockets are full of pages of comments that have said something along the lines of, if you adopt this idea, it will create jobs.
But in general, do people come to you and say, even though it makes no sense, do they come to you and say, regulate more and that will create more jobs?
And for instance, in the net neutrality context, yes, that was one of the arguments made. I happen to believe that actually didn't make sense in that context. But I think at the heart of your question is, do regulations create jobs? And we can sort of distill it all down. It doesn't necessarily take a PhD in economics to understand this, which is, if you're an international investor and you have the choice of investing in one of two countries, and country A has high regulation and high taxation, and country B has lower regulation and lower taxation, which one are you going to invest in? So I think I'm right that it doesn't take a PhD, although hopefully you do see the answer there. It's not going to be country A, it's probably going to be country B. So you have to be very careful of what it is you do. Here at the Commission, I believe that we have to, first of all, make sure what we do is constitutional. Second of all, is faithful to the statute or pursuant to a court order that's clear. But if we have the discretion beyond that to be more deregulatory, unless there's compelling evidence showing there's a market failure that can be cured by a narrowly tailored rule that is hopefully sunsetted, then we should not embark upon more regulation.
When items are presented to the commissioners, have you ever seen an estimate of the effect on employment of a proposed regulation?
Not per se. I mean, especially from an economist's perspective, I think there is very little in terms of exhaustive economic analyses that go into most FCC orders. In fact, I'm trying to think of one right now that had an exhaustive economic analysis, and maybe you can think of one, but I can't think of any right now. So no.
President Obama, I believe, was last winter started an initiative to try to remove some regulations. Has this had an effect at the Commission?
Well, I think it has. I think Chairman Janikowski has tried to come up with some ideas for things to take off the books. I've been suggesting a number of things for several years, and sometimes those ideas have now overlapped, and that's good. But I think there should really be a sustained, comprehensive, long-term effort to examine all of our rules at the Commission. If you look at the statute, for instance, there's certainly Section 10, Section 11, Section 202H, Section 706, and some others that all have sort of a deregulatory bent. And if you look at how regulation has increased at the Commission, the number of pages of regulation, one metric to measure that by in the past 50 years has increased well over 800%, while the economy has increased about 350% in the past 50 years. So I think it's time for us to have a comprehensive audit of all of our regulations and see what can be taken off the books. And really the presumption should be it's not needed unless there's compelling evidence to the contrary.
The network neutrality order, which you mentioned earlier, is going to come into effect in the coming weeks. Finally appears to have cleared OMB. Let me quote a statement attached to that proceeding. Less investment, less innovation, increased business costs, increased prices for consumers, disadvantages to smaller ISPs, jobs lost, and all of this in the name of promoting the exact opposite. The evidence in the record simply does not support the majority's outcome-driven conclusions. I believe you authored those words.
There's a cross-examination here. Yes, I did.
I think they're wonderful. I assume these words are still true today as they were back in December.
Yeah, the record really reflected a couple of things. One, there was no problem to be solved. There was no certainly systemic market failure. There wasn't really even de minimis market failure. And we can talk about if there had been market failure, what we could have done. No, and certainly there was no statutory authority for us to do what we did. But what was in the record was evidence that all those things you just enumerated from the quote could happen as a result of it. And that's the concern, is what are the unintended consequences with any rule? Yeah. But in this case, you're asking about this one in particular, what are going to be the unintended consequences of it? And there was more evidence in the record actually indicating that it would actually cause more harm than good, and irreparable harm.
As you're mentioning, every new rule is supposed to have attached to it a regulatory flexibility analysis under the Regulatory Flexibility Act, which is supposed to be an estimate of the costs and benefits of a rule. They're supposed to be prepared, both the NPRM and then at the final rule. Let me just quote something from that very network neutrality order. And this goes to exactly the point you're making, which is the regulatory flexibility analysis asserted, I don't think there was any evidence at all, for the following. Today, the Commission takes an important step to preserve the Internet as an open platform for innovation, investment, job creation, economic growth, competition, and free expression. Does that make any sense to you?
Well, certainly that was one of the selling points for proponents for this order. If you look at the order itself, there is no market analysis, and it pretty much says so explicitly in the order. Under the Regulatory Flexibility Act, which is a compound question here, so there's a lot to talk about. The Regulatory Flexibility Act, if you look at the history of it in the appellate courts, really is kind of toothless. I testified before the Cliff Stearns Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee of the House Commerce Committee last July 7th, I think it was, and said, basically the RFA is essentially toothless, that all it requires you to do is to lay out what are the possible harms to small businesses in particular. It doesn't prohibit an administrative agency from implementing a rule that might be harmful to business, but it says you just have to lay it out and recognize it. And if you look at the appellate history, there's really not much an appellant can do to use the RFA to reverse an agency decision, for instance. So I think if you also look at a lot of, not just the FCC, but other administrative agencies, if you look at their RFA analyses, they tend to be pretty boilerplate and repeat themselves. So that is one area I think that the House Energy and Commerce Committee is looking at, to maybe reforming the RFA or coming up with a new act altogether. And that might be very, very worthwhile. So what's the point of having it if it just makes the agency sort of lay out the possible effects, which can be bent either way, selectively, depending on whatever the outcome-driven objective is of a particular order. What good does it do anybody to do that? So if it can't be reversed in court.
Does the Commission even do that? For example, network neutrality order, did the Commission actually lay out all of the potential harms that it might do for small businesses or businesses of any size?
It did not in that order. I cite that in my dissent, and certainly, as I said before, no real bona fide economic analysis. It admits as much. And RFA does not really require an economic analysis, as a PhD in economics would view it anyway. But it's probably a good idea, and I've suggested that as much, that there should be a market analysis either justifying a rule that's going to be adopted, or if the Commission decides not to do a market analysis, it needs to sort of state its reason why. I think the Commission should have the flexibility to do that, but that would prevent some rules from being implemented just sort of willy-nilly without really having a fair, full discussion of what the effects on the market might actually be. And we hear a lot about market failure, but one topic that doesn't really get discussed enough is regulatory failure. And how do rules actually cause harm to the marketplace? Sometimes it's hard to measure, and I'll let you speak, you're more capable of speaking this to me than I am, rather. It's hard to measure what didn't happen as a result of government action. What was the innovation that never was invented or never came to market? There's really not a list of those somewhere. There's no repository where people submit those that data. So it's harder to quantify sometimes, and it's especially harder to quantify with an ex-ante rule, such as the net neutrality rules.
There are issues just, I mean, granted, you can't measure these things, you can't do the analysis, but at times I wonder if there's even an effort that's being made. I had an intern review the notices of proposed rulemaking in 2011 for the FCC, and it seemed like roughly half the time the Commission just simply said, well, we're going to exempt ourselves. We're not even going to try. We're not even going to try.
Exempt ourselves from?
Providing a regulatory flexibility analysis. We're just not even going to do it.
Right, and if that's the case, if it's so apparent, if it's not even a fig leaf of a few paragraphs, I think you can just look to the appellate history of the RFA and see what's the harm to an agency for doing that. Their order is not going to be reversed or remanded if they just skip right over it.
I think the House Judiciary Committee, and I think there's a companion bill in the Senate to strengthen the RFA that was introduced about a week ago. And I think I don't know that it'll go anywhere right now, but it's something that probably needs to happen as you describe it. There's no judicial appeal process. There's no enforcement mechanism to be sure that these agencies are actually considering costs and benefits.
This kind of scares me.
Well, what I have here are the comments from, and I sorry to focus on the network neutrality order, but I think it's an example of just how costs and benefits really aren't being considered in any systematic way, or really not at all. And the Commission just kind of writes up things that don't seem to have any basis. And let me just I'm just going to quote again from the order. Get your reaction to this. The rules adopted, and this is from the network neutrality order, the rules adopted in this order are generally consistent with current industry practices, so the costs of compliance should be small. Although some commenters assert that a disclosure rule will impose significant burdens on broadband providers, no commenters cite any particular source of increased costs or attempts to estimate costs of compliance. For a number of reasons, we believe, we're into belief now, we believe the costs of the disclosure rule we adopt today are outweighed by the benefits of empowering end users to make informed choices and of facilitating the enforcement of other open internet rules. So let me see if I have this straight. The FCC does not have a credible cost estimate for the new rule. Some commenters complain that the disclosure rule will, quote, impose significant burdens on broadband providers. But because commenters have provided no cost study, the FCC says the Commission's lack of a study trumps the commenters' lack of a study. So if you have a competing no study by the FCC, no study by the commenters.
Our vacuum wins, yes. Our vacuum of knowledge wins, yeah.
So that's
Right.
what that means?
That's exactly what that means. Right. So really the burden should be the other way around. We've seen a pattern over time that the FCC can overreach its statutory bounds. First of all, it can not have evidence to do that, even if it had a statutory authority. So there's no evidence in the record really to justify an action, whether it's that action or something else. The burden really should be the other way around. The burden really should be on whoever is proposing the rule to actually prove that the rule is needed, and that there isn't some other law. With net neutrality, I want to make it clear, we should have an open and free internet, absolutely. And I think if there were evidence of systemic market failure, the government could do something there. Congress would have to act before the FCC would have the authority to do anything. But in the meantime, there are laws already on the books. There are breach of contract laws, there are fraud laws, there are consumer protection laws, there are antitrust laws, tortious interference with contract laws. There are a number of laws, and there have been cases. There's a class action suit against RCN, for instance. There have been cases where existing law has cured any de minimis issue that has popped up in that area. So in the meantime, though, when a commission is going to overstep its boundary without evidence, we don't know what the unintended consequences or the regulatory failure might be as a result of that. And that is a harder bumper sticker to make than maybe what the proponents of some rules are able to come up with. We need to fix X problem, therefore do this. It gets more complicated than that very quickly.
Let me read a statement that you made recently.
Sure you don't have a law degree? Yeah?
No.
No?
No.
You related to Tim Russert at all? Or, no? Okay. Just, you put it up in a PowerPoint.
Section 706 of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 requires the Commission to issue a report determining whether advanced telecommunications capabilities is being deployed to all Americans in a reasonable and timely fashion. In all the reports, starting with the first in 1999, the Commission has answered yes to that question. In its 2010 706 report, however, the Commission dramatically reversed course and concluded that broadband is not being deployed in a reasonable and timely fashion to all Americans. The Commission issued the same conclusion in its 2011 report. I dissented from both reports because their conclusions were inaccurate and unsettling. Furthermore, I have repeatedly warned that such conclusions could be used to support a regulatory agenda with unintended and harmful effects. Could you expand on that? Why did the Commission suddenly reverse course on Section 706 reports and on wireless competition reports and other things? Is this part of a regulatory agenda? Why does the Commission want to change course after 10, 15 years through different administrations reaching an exact opposite conclusion?
Right. So I can't speak for the majority, and I'm sure the majority wouldn't want me speaking for them. But so we can all hypothesize and guess. But with the 706 report in particular, from 2003 to the end of 2009, we saw broadband availability go from 15% availability to 95% of the country having access to broadband. And you're right, under both Democrat and Republican administrations, the FCC had concluded that 706 was being satisfied and that the broadband was being deployed in a timely and reasonable fashion. If you look at the bent of 706, the report language and other things too, it speaks to how if broadband weren't being deployed fast enough, essentially what can the Commission do to deregulate, to remove barriers to entry in a deregulatory way. Instead, that was put on its ear to say, well, first of all, the majority is saying it wasn't deployed to all Americans. We still have 5% of Americans who don't have access, so now it's probably about 4% or maybe even less, but anyway, at the time, 5%. So therefore, this triggers Commission power, expansive Commission power to do something. And the something is to erect more regulatory barriers, to impose more regulation. So it laid the groundwork. If you see it cited in the net neutrality order, you see it cited in the data roaming order. And data roaming is a whole nother, it's related, but another kettle of fish. We actually have explicit statutory section under 332 that prohibits the Commission from doing what it did. But also, basically the foundation the Commission laid legally was we can do whatever we want so long as we say it is related to broadband deployment and adoption. And that's not what Congress intended. If so, they would have said so. And they would have said so very differently from the plain language of Section 706. So one can only conclude, I think, that, now that I am speaking for the majority, that they did so in order to help lay a legal foundation for other actions they would want to take, and whether that was net neutrality, data roaming, or other things. That'll be tested in the courts, and we'll see where it ends up.
Do you see a future commission continuing with the trend of saying not sufficient competition, not sufficient deployment, or do you see a future commission going back to the prior position?
Well, I guess it depends. I mean, it depends on who's appointed and who's chair and all the rest. So now, in the meantime, the courts are going to have their say. So, you know, the data roaming decision more than likely will come out before the net neutrality decision does. So we'll start to see what the courts are thinking about this argument pretty soon.
I assume you would say the Commission did not adequately explain the change of course that they took. The record didn't support.
Well, that could be one argument, certainly. I mean, that's an APA argument. I think the evidence doesn't support its conclusion. And then the step, or a couple steps down the flow chart from there, is that it interpreted the statute incorrectly. It doesn't have expansive authority radiating from 706 if it determines that 5% of Americans don't have access to broadband, therefore the Commission can do whatever it wants. Mm-hmm. That's not at all what Congress was thinking, in my view. I don't know, you helped write it. What do you think?
Oh, no. I was just staff. I was there to help.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure Earl's going to have his say in a minute, though. So.
Yeah, I think Earl actually worked on 706. Okay. You know, you made a lot of these points that we've just been discussing in congressional testimony, and I assume that must have been before Congressman Stern's committee. What do you think Congress can and should do to enable the Commission to get to more reasoned decisions? I think a lot of people would be troubled if they were told that regulatory agencies such as the FCC make decisions really without any record or any concern that they don't have a record of what the costs and the benefits of those rules might be.
Well, you know, Congress can have the best of intentions to try to make our mission or the mission of any part of government very explicit. And then it's always up to whomever is charged with the duty of executing Congress's intent to either try to be faithful to the plain language of the statute or to be more adventurous and creative and go beyond that. And then, I mean, you can go all the way back to what, Marbury versus Madison, to for judicial review, to say, and then the courts come in, and it's as part of the process. You have the legislation, regulation, litigation cycle, and in a way, that's the American way, I guess. And I don't know if there's anything to do to stop that. And I think actually part of the process can be very healthy. I think you can have reasonable people have reasonable differences over what an agency's mission is. Reasonable people come to me and talk to me about the public interest standard that the FCC has. You know, it can be very expansive, and others say no, it should be more narrow. And both of those can be reasonable arguments, and I can agree with one side over another, and then hopefully we all do so in a reasonable way. But then it goes to court, and the courts, tell us at the end of the day they're the umpires and tell us if it's a ball or a strike.
Speaking of which, how do you interpret the public interest standard?
In what context? Like,
You think it's context specific?
It is ambiguous. It is not specifically defined. You have to it does depend on the context. I think you have to look at appellate decisions depending what the context is. In the course of merger reviews, and not any particular merger, but as to what kinds of conditions can be put on approval. Public interest, the public interest standard, to some means something very expansive. It could be conditions that really have nothing to do with the potential consumer harm that might arise out of an aspect of a merger. According to some, I don't buy into that. I think we really should have it narrowly focused on what is the potential market harm, consumer harm that will come about as a result of some particular aspect of that, requires a divestiture or some other condition. Then let's do that, but let's do it in a narrowly tailored, perhaps sunsetted way, so that once the potential harm is cured by competition or whatever the case might be, then the rule can go away. So that's just one example, and others think it's expansive. I think it is contextual, and there might be other parts of the statute or some court decision which dictates how far you can go.
One of the hot topics in internet law today is privacy. It seems that practically every major corporation and every government agency has a privacy officer. Government agencies, including the FCC, vie for control over the regulation of internet privacy. Where do you see regulation of internet privacy going? Is it something that will ultimately be assigned to one agency? Do you see multiple agencies continuing to have a role? What do you see as the future of government regulation of privacy on the internet?
It's interesting. So when I learned of the news last night about Steve Jobs passing away, I was also reminded of the inventor of the cell phone that therefore made the iPhone possible. And some people in the audience may know the name Marty Cooper, who's still very much alive. And he gave a great 60 Minutes interview. They did a great story on him, which I highly recommend to folks. You can watch it online at 60 Minutes website. I think it was May or June of last year. And he was asked that question by Morley Safer, what about privacy? Because Marty was talking about how the next generation of communications devices will be implanted, and you just touch something or say something, and your commands will be carried out. And it's a fascinating segment, and Morley Safer asked him, so what about privacy? And Marty, who's a very benign fellow, for any of you all know him or have seen him, said, I'm sorry, but privacy is a thing of the past. And he didn't mean it in a chilling way, but it kind of came across as chilling. So with all the benefits of technology, any new technology, there's going to be a way to use that technology in a nefarious way, right? Fire, which maybe it started with fire. You can cook your food or sterilize something. You can also burn down your neighbor's house, right? So we have to be careful. I think we have to be careful that policies to protect privacy or policies against intellectual property theft or whatever the case might be, we want to make sure they aren't used for some other purpose that squelches freedom. But I don't think the FCC should be the privacy agency. We do have a couple of discrete sections, Section 222, one or two sections in Title III and Title VI. But beyond that, our purview is very narrow. FTC or other agencies are better suited, I think, to handle those issues. And because they're, for a variety of reasons, but it cuts across industries and technologies and business plans beyond our capacity, I think, at the Commission. So it's going to be an ongoing debate. My gray hair will turn white, and we'll still be asking a lot of these questions.
When it comes to internet regulation, the internet doesn't have easily determined boundaries. What do you see as the future of federal versus state regulation of the internet? What is the role of states for regulating?
Yikes. So, I've said many times, and this irritates some people, that the internet is the greatest deregulatory success story of all time. Now, folks will point out, well, it started off as a government creature. Yes, it sure did. And by about 1990, that government creature had about, fewer than 100,000 users. Once it was privatized, it expanded now to, half the planet has some sort of access to the internet. And it's historically, since the mid-90s, has migrated further away from government involvement through the multi-stakeholder approach of engineers, academics, business, consumers, whatever, all coming together to work in that non-governmental way, that bottom-up type of way, to make sure that it runs and works and expands and thrives and prospers and serves people. And that's why we've seen it proliferate faster than really any other major disruptive technology in the history of mankind. So I think the worst thing that we could do is to see either a balkanization of it, which we're starting to see, or what really gives me chills is this movement sort of by the BRIC coalitions, Brazil, Russia, India and China, Saudi Arabia and some others, to have an overarching international internet regulatory authority. This isn't the stuff of black helicopter conspiracy theorists. This is actually happening openly, being debated at the UN, at the Internet Governance Forum, and other places. And I think we really need to keep the multi-stakeholder approach that's flat and bottom-up, that has worked very well. And so if we were to start to balkanize it with, country by country or federal and state, or why stop at the states? Why not local, cities and towns all have their own sets of regulations. I think that would start to drive away investments and innovation, and we would start to sort of kill the goose that laid the golden egg. Other than that, it's a great idea. So.
Well, I think with those words of wisdom, I think I'm going to open it up for questions from the floor.
Or complaints, or counter-arguments.
We have a microphone that will be passed around. Please identify yourselves for our viewing audience. Sure.
Hello, Commissioner McDowell. How are you today?
Hello. Eliza, how are you?
Hi, Eliza with Politico, for those who don't know me. Topic of the day, USF. Do you support the plan that the chairman is putting out today?
Okay, you've read his speech. I haven't yet read his speech yet, so I apologize. But so what I will say is we'll get, tonight is a white copy deadline. So for those of you who don't know what that is, it means 21 days before a meeting, we get drafts of whatever it is we're supposed to vote on. We've already received some drafts of some aspects of this. So we'll know a lot more tonight. It'll probably be late tonight, so I'll know a lot more probably in the morning. So if you want to ask me again in the morning. But in the meantime, over the next 21 days, I think we're going to see a lot of dialogue among the commissioners and here in the next couple of weeks from anyone who wants to come in to talk to us more about it. This has been going on now for years. We came very close 3 years ago. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats were united in major reforms of intercarrier compensation, universal service distribution, and contributions, which we're not doing now, unfortunately. So I'm optimistic that we will have a vote. We will vote out several items in this area on October 27th. Exactly what it's going to look like, though, I don't have any answers for you yet.
Are you optimistic that you'll be able to support it from what you've seen?
Well, I think it's going to be, I'm optimistic that the chairman and I will be able to come to agreement on a lot of things. Yes, I'm very optimistic. That doesn't mean I'm giving, just to be clear, I'm not giving any wholesale endorsements to whatever he said this morning because I haven't read what he said. But I am very optimistic that we can come to agreement, and the collegiality and the level of dialogue and the level of flow of information among the commissioners is excellent, and the staff is excellent right now.
Tom in the back.
Hi, Tom Hazlett.
Hey.
George Mason University.
How are you?
I want to congratulate you on your dissenting opinion in the net neutrality order, which was very nicely done. I'm sure the courts will be reading it carefully. And I just add to your discussion about the, their vacuum versus our vacuum. There was in the record, there was economic evidence about the effects of such rules, but of course the Commission's order just said that there was none. So that's just the way they read it.
Excellent clarification. Thank you.
So it really wasn't a 0-0 game. So you talk a lot about the lack of economic analysis and how it's a problem at the Commission in these orders. So some have looked at this and compared the FCC with, say, the Department of Justice Antitrust Division and the Federal Trade Commission, and they've noticed a very stark difference in structure. Both of the other agencies, both of which deal with many similar issues on competition policy, as does the FCC, have independent offices for economic analysis. And they're staffed by a large group of professionals and have within the agency fairly important line responsibilities and independence. The Federal Communications Commission has no such bureau or office of economic analysis that has independence to do economic analysis. So it has been put forth that there should be some structural change to make something like that happen. What is your view on that? Would you support or be open to such a thing? And do you think that there would be more kind of support for that at the Commission?
Yeah, generally speaking, I'm not a big fan of creating new offices or bureaus within the FCC. We certainly, let me give a little bit of background. We certainly have some fine economists who work at the FCC, and they are in various offices and bureaus throughout the Commission. We traditionally have a chief economist that serves a one-year stint, usually comes in from academia, and then they cycle out, and sometimes they come back, but that's only happened once, I think. That was Michelle Conley. For my alma mater, Duke. That's the only reason I'm giving that plug. But anyway, thanks for the Duke Blue Hudson Institute wallpaper here. But I think that in theory could work well to have an independent office of economic analysis if it's independent. A lot of independent offices in government agencies that end up not being so independent. You don't know where it's going to go. I mean, different economists have different philosophies or different ways of thinking or approaching into their different models, different ways of approaching the same data and coming out with very different conclusions. That could be helpful. I think any chairman could sort of create that almost on an ad hoc basis, either item by item that goes through, or just to say for all items that go through, there's going to be this team of economists that already exists, that are already employed by the Commission, that could look at that, and that could be very valuable. Yeah, there have been other suggestions by congressional offices that each FCC office have a full-time engineer on staff. So by statute, we're given 3 lawyers, full-time engineer. Others have said full-time economist. I'm not sure with the engineer we have enough work to keep them busy full-time. And our Office of Engineering and Technology is very accessible. But so again, I'm not one for wanting to create new offices and bureaus, but having the idea of having independent economic analyses, I think would be very valuable. And perhaps there should be, as we discussed earlier, a statutory requirement that we do bona fide economic analyses and market analyses of the effects of whatever it is that's proposed or that we're ordering into law.
That's just moving forward. Yeah, over there.
Hi, Juliana Grunwald with National Journal. As you well know, that the Commission currently has 2 vacancies, and you could be down to 3 commissioners at the end of the year. Are you concerned that Congress still has time to vote on those? Obviously, the White House has yet to nominate anybody for those spots. And if you do go down to 3 at the end of the year, will that hamper the Commission's work?
So first of all, we have technically one vacancy. Commissioner Copps has to leave sine die of Congress this year, or when a replacement is confirmed. So we have 4 of us. I'm not going to, am I concerned? Congress has plenty of time. I mean, the super committee deadline is December 23rd. So let's all expect Congress to be in until December 23rd, realistically. That's a lot of time to get this done if they so choose. But if we were to shrink down to 3, that's by no means the end of the world. We were at 3 during the digital TV transition, and we worked wonderfully together. It was Acting Chairman Copps, Commissioner Adelstein, and myself, and it was actually very efficient. So it's not all bad.
Lynn Stanton, TR Daily. During his speech today, the chairman mentioned expected cost savings to consumers from the inter-carrier compensation changes that he's proposing. Do you picture that really working out? And in particular, I'm thinking he made reference to the last time when long-distance rates went down, but now most people are paying a flat rate per month. And it seems as though the pressures in the market on a flat-rated package as opposed to a per-minute package would be a little bit different.
Well, I think, we're all very aware of the concern that somehow of what the commission might do could be perceived as raising consumers' rates. And I don't think that's going to be the case at all. I think, first of all, in rural America, so the high-cost fund, we're talking about, just high-cost distribution, there's more competition in rural America, mainly because of wireless, and some with cable, but mainly wireless. So that puts downward pressure, more competition, generally speaking, puts downward pressure on rates, on prices to consumers. So that should continue, that proliferation of competition and downward pressure. If a carrier chooses to raise the subscriber line charge, the SLIC as we call it, that's their choice, but I'm not sure that's a wise business decision. And I do think the market is moving more into the direction of consumers being able to buy buckets of features and services and minutes or whatever the case might be. And if you look at the value that consumers are getting for their telecom dollar now versus 10 or 15 years ago, that value has gone way up, actually. So I hope the stories for the press in the room aren't written that what the FCC is doing is going to raise rates. I don't think in the long run it will. And keep in mind this, whatever we do will be phased in over a period of years. So that's going to allow more time for more competition and more downward pressure on rates and more upward pressure on innovation and value given to the consumer. Jerry?
Thank you, Jerry Udwin with the Udwin Group. And to follow up a little bit about what could be done to improve processes at the FCC, and I know that Commissioner Scott-Roth appropriately refrained from lecturing Congress when he was a commissioner, and I know that's not a position to put you in, but there is legislation pending in the House committee by House Republicans that would aim at improving the processes. Can you make some suggestions on what could make things work better at the commission, either that the commission could do or some of the ingredients of what's discussed as legislation might be helpful?
And thank you, Jerry, and thank you for reminding me to say, I don't tell Congress what to do, they tell me what to do. We subscribe to that philosophy. So if it's an explicit mandate, even if I disagree with it, unless it's unconstitutional in my view, I will carry it out. And thank you also for your work on Sunshine Act reform. So that is the number one. I think all 4 of us agree, I know Commissioner Copps and I do, on the need to reform the Sunshine Act. For members of Congress, they could lose the spin on that pretty quickly, which is, would they, through reform, be advocating more secrecy in government? Well, we certainly don't want that. We don't want commissioners to be able to meet in secret and vote on things, and the public not to understand what their reasoning and rationale was for a particular vote. But the way the law operates today is no more than 2 of us may meet, no more than 2 commissioners may meet at a time, and that really does slow down information flow. It breaks down collegiality, and creates a more inefficient process, which can be gamed by chairmen if they so choose. So allowing us all to meet perhaps in the presence of the general counsel and to make sure we're not actually voting and to make sure that at the end of the day, if we vote out an order, that the rationale for whatever the vote is clearly explained, which is supposed to be today and frequently is for the most part, then if Congress can make changes like that, I think that would be positive and constructive and in the public interest.
Good afternoon, Chairman. My name is Todd Wiggins, and I live in D.C. I have a question about some of the functions of the FCC as far as censorship, if in fact you do get into in that realm in some aspect. The internet, as you know, has been characterized as a Wild West frontier in terms of its inability to control content relative to, say, its predecessor, the traditional television that we grew up with. So do you get involved in at all in content control? That obviously Gen Xers, Yers, et cetera, are growing up with access to content that parents may not feel is in their best interest in raising their kids. So what do you do about that?
Excellent question. Thank you for asking. And so we don't have jurisdiction over content on the internet, if that's the heart of your question. But in general, content control, for the most part, is limited to the indecency issue for broadcasters only. So between the hours of 6 a.m. and 10 p.m., the Commission has a duty to enforce the indecency laws. And the objective there and the constitutional argument there is this is all in the name of protecting children. Part of this is on appeal before the Supreme Court, something that we'll hear and decide this term, which just started on Monday. And so that is the issue of fleeting expletives, and I'm eager for the court to rule on this so we can get to work. Now, my second week on the job in June of 2006, I was invited to a bill signing ceremony where President Bush signed into law a statute that increased the fines on broadcasters by tenfold. It was passed by an overwhelming bipartisan majority of Congress, and so the directly elected representatives of the American people clearly directed the FCC to enforce those laws, and with extra energy, I would say. So the legislative branch spoke on that, and now the judicial branch will speak on a large part of it. What will be interesting to see in the coming years, though, is, and possibly with this decision, but I don't think the court will deem it ripe, but it's the whole doctrine of what's called spectrum scarcity. So spectrum scarcity says the government can regulate speech on the broadcast platform, this is a decades-old concept, because of the limited number of outlets. And that was early to mid-20th century doctrine, and then reaffirmed in 1978 with the Pacifica case at the Supreme Court. So with all the outlets offered now by cable television, which didn't exist back then in the same way, the internet, satellite TV and radio, internet radio, will the court say, yes, there's one platform still where speech can be regulated like no other? So if we had the same speech regulations on newspapers, most Americans probably wouldn't tolerate that. But it's still considered okay for broadcast. Again, not for cable, but for broadcast. So I'll be curious to see where the courts go. Justice Thomas has basically, in the last iteration of this litigation that went up to the court and went back down just purely on administrative process grounds, he sort of begged the question. He was sort of begging for some sort of amicus brief or cross petition or whatever on the spectrum scarcity issue. Again, I don't know if the court will take that up or go that far, but someday it may. And so for all the sort of academic types in the room, it's going to be interesting to watch that issue over the coming years. Thank you. Good question.
Earl?
Uh-oh, here comes the big guns. I'm in for it now.
Hi, Earl Comstock with Comstock Consulting. Commissioner McDowell, I think it was very interesting that the debate and discussion today you focused on the internet a lot of the time, but you also mentioned that Congress needed to give you better direction on the internet and the FCC's jurisdiction over the same. Certainly, that's the tenet of your analysis and the internet neutrality rules. So I'm just curious if you could sort of follow up on that. We also heard a little bit about the possibility of balkanization, local or state people getting involved. If the FCC, in fact, doesn't have jurisdiction over the internet, how can they preempt state or local actions on the same? So just be curious on your thoughts on what further guidance might be needed.
Excellent, excellent question. So I wasn't, just to clarify, I was not asking for Congress to act, but what I was trying to explain is in the context of net neutrality that if that became an issue, Congress would have to act. If there was evidence of systemic market failure, Congress would have to give somebody the authority, provided other statutes that other bodies of law that already exist were deemed insufficient, and I think they are sufficient. So actually, I don't think Congress needs to act in terms of the net neutrality context. In terms of preemption, periodically every few years, I see Jamie York back there, and I think of Senator Allen and the Internet Tax Moratorium, and that for some reason has never been made permanent and should be, but that comes up every few years, so there's federal preemption there. Yeah, certainly the FCC doesn't have the authority to, I guess, preempt the states, but other branches of government may, and I haven't entirely thought that through, but I would hate to see a balkanization of county by county or town by town or city by city of the internet. It would shut it down for all practical purposes. So if we need to have Congress preempt in a deregulatory way regulation of the internet, that might be good, and at the international level as well.
We have one more question up here in the front.
Hi, Hans Kuttner, Hudson Institute. This is one of those, the embers in the fire are dying behind you. You've had your second glass of scotch, and
Oh boy.
We can sort of...
I'm liable to say anything if that's the case.
Those more expansive kind of questions. A word that came up a bit earlier was the Constitution. So one could, under theories of a unitary executive, conclude that the FCC is sort of an aberrancy and all these sort of New Deal kind of things, and that they're not really consistent with the notion of a unitary executive. So one could have an alternative structure in which, rather than there being this independent commission, one had someone who was more aligned with the structure of the executive branch, an administrator in some cabinet department, and thus directly accountable to the president. There are pros and cons on this. Here we have two people who have served in the current system. What would be some of the pros and cons about this alternative scheme? And then your final judgment as to whether we'll be a better or worse place with a unitary executive and the authorities of the commission invested in a single administrator.
And you're asking
Both?
Harold as well.
Yes,
Why don't you go
yes,
first,
yes.
because I've been going first. See, you didn't know you were going to get asked that question. Look, you're turning the tables.
Harold
This
can
is
say
great.
he had the third glass of scotch and isn't coherent enough.
I'm so asleep on the couch.
But anyway, yeah.
I'm never coherent, so it's not unusual. Hans, as you know, I actually wrote a book on this very topic, a tough act to follow, and the thesis was when you combine the three elements of government, legislative, executive, judicial, into a single entity, there's no incentive to follow the law. That you can always correct your mistakes on the administrative side or on the judicial side. And so I think you're right. I think there's serious problems. I don't know that I would put all of the powers of an independent agency in the executive branch, because the independent agencies, they write rules, which are legislative functions. They enforce and administer the rules, which is an executive function, and then they resolve disputes under those rules, which is the judicial function. So I would separate them out. But that, I have to say, I think that train left the station 80 years ago, or arguably going back to the ICC 140 years ago. And I don't know that you're ever going to get it back. So we have these entities, these independent agencies, and for better or worse, we're going to have to figure out some way to live with them, and it's not an easy process. But I leave it to Commissioner McDowell to have the word on that.
So are you saying that they are not constitutional, independent agencies?
Look, I'm just a dumb economist. I'm not a fancy constitutional lawyer. I have no idea. But I do see.
You can read, though.
I
can read the Constitution.
Occasionally I can read.
Yeah.
I would say I don't think they've worked very well. I don't think it's a very efficient way of doing business or doing government. But that's just my view.
You know, we hear the idea frequently that the rulemaking function of administrative agencies should be housed in the executive branch, and perhaps a adjudicatory function should be independent, as is the judiciary. Interesting idea. I think Harold points out a very good pragmatic reality, which is, you know, will that ever happen? I don't know. These things, we tend to develop traditions in this country after a matter of a few years, and so now we have a tradition stretching over several generations of independent agencies. But I think it's healthy to have the dialogue and the discussion, and you know, in that new agencies might need to be created in the eyes of some for other purposes we can't imagine right now. Perhaps that's the way to go. But I would, if you feel strongly about it, continue to talk to your members of Congress. It's really a political question for Congress as much as anything.
And with that, please join me in thanking Commissioner McDowell for being with us today and enlightening us on many issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor.